The richest cattle baron in the territory walked into his own saloon dressed like a broke drifter. Nobody knew who he was. He wasn't there for whiskey or cards. He was hunting for something money couldn't buy: honesty. But in a town full of fake smiles and dirty deals, what he found instead was a secret so dangerous it could bring his whole empire crashing down. Dust clung to his boots and hat as the stranger pushed through the swinging doors of Deadman's saloon. The piano went quiet. A few cowhands at the bar turned to stare. He looked like any broke drifter: old coat, sun-faded shirt, and boots worn down to the heel. What no one knew was that this man owned half the cattle in the territory and the railroad that ran through town. His name was James Blackwood, though tonight he wasn't James the Baron. He was just another nameless traveler. The saloon was the finest place in 3 counties. Red velvet curtains, gold-rimmed mirrors, and whiskey so rare only the rich could taste it. At polished tables sat ranch lords, gamblers, and lawmen, their pockets heavy with silver. The hostess gave him one look, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Only table left's by the kitchen, stranger. The worst seat in the house, right by the banging doors and the smell of stew pots." James nodded. "That'll do." As he walked past, the crowd sized him up. Some laughed, others sneered. To them he was dirt, a man with nothing. But James felt a strange satisfaction. In their eyes, he was invisible, and that was exactly what he wanted. The doors to the kitchen swung open, and out stepped Rosie Vance, a young waitress carrying a tray of tin cups. Her dress was neat, but faded from too many washes, and her shoes were worn thin from long hours. On the floor, most folks in the saloon looked past her like she was part of the furniture. But when Rosie set a cup of water in front of James, she met his eyes and gave him a real smile. Not the fake kind folks put on for rich men, but the kind that said, "I see you." "Evenin', sir," she said softly. "Name's Rosie. I'll be taking care of you tonight. You want a drink to start?" James studied her. No painted-on cheer like the hostess, no sneer like the gamblers, just a tired young woman doing her best in a hard world. He tipped his hat. "Whiskey! Cheapest you got." Rosie didn't flinch. She didn't glance at his boots, didn't question his coin. She just nodded and said, "Comin' right up," before disappearing back into the crowd. For the first time all night, James felt something stir, a sliver of curiosity, maybe even hope. Rosie brought back the cheap whiskey, setting it gently on the table. James took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving the room. He'd seen enough saloons in his life to know when folks judged a man by the dust on his boots. Tonight was no different. When Rosie returned with her notepad, James leaned back in his chair. "Think I'll take your finest cut of beef," he said, "and pour me a glass of that rarest whiskey sittin' on the top shelf." Rosie's pen froze. The finest cut was a $50 longhorn steak, a meal made for cattle barons and crooked sheriffs, not for a man dressed like he could barely afford a bedroll. The whiskey alone cost more than most folks made in a week. Her heart pounded. If this man couldn't pay, she would be the one Finch docked and punished. But when she looked into James's eyes, she didn't see madness or bluff. She saw calm certainty, like a man laying down a hand of cards he already knew would win. She steadied herself and gave the faintest smile. "An excellent choice, sir. How do you like your steak cooked?" "Medium rare," James replied, his tone quiet but firm. From across the room, Finch, the slick saloon manager, caught sight of the order and stormed toward Rosie, his face red as hot iron. James watched, silent, as Finch leaned in close to her, hissing words only she could hear. She tried to stand tall, but fear flickered in her eyes. James understood then. This wasn't just a test of the staff. Something darker was brewing inside his own saloon. Rosie carried the steak and whiskey to James's table, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. She set the plate down, but her mind wasn't on the food. It was on the danger that lurked behind the polished bar, where Finch's watchful eyes never left her. She couldn't keep living like this. Finch had her cornered, threatening her job, threatening her sick brother's life. And now, by some stroke of fate, this stranger, this drifter who wasn't really a drifter, had landed in her section. As James finished his meal, Rosie cleared the table. And in that small, ordinary act, she slipped a folded scrap of parchment beneath his bill. Her heart raced like a runaway horse. She knew he expected a phone number, maybe a plea for money. But when James unfolded the note under the table, 4 words stopped him cold. "They're watching. Cattle's poisoned." Then, below it, one final line. "Check Finch's ledger." James's grip tightened. This wasn't the game he thought he was playing. He came hunting for honesty. And instead, he'd stumbled onto a conspiracy that could rot his whole empire from the inside out. James slid the note into his pocket, careful not to let Finch see. He left cash on the table, exact to the cent, and rose from his seat. The saloon's laughter and piano music rang hollow now. Every face looked different. Every smile felt false. He pushed through the swinging doors and stepped into the cool night. The dusty street was quiet, lanterns flickering in the wind. He leaned against the wall, pulled out the note again, and read the words under the dim glow of the lamplight. "They're watching. Cattle's poisoned. Check Finch's ledger." His chest tightened. Poisoned cattle meant more than just bad business. It meant sick families, ruined trade, maybe even death. If it was true, Finch wasn't just cheating him. He was poisoning the very people James's empire fed. James took a long breath. He had come here disguised as a drifter to test honesty. Instead, he had uncovered rot inside his own saloon. Thaitun, disguise had given him eyes to see the truth. And now, the cattle baron who ruled half the territory knew one thing for certain. Before the sun rose, he had to get his hands on Finch's ledger. The night in Deadwood Hollow was colder than most. The wind carried dust down the main street, rattling loose shutters and whistling through the cracks of the old wooden buildings. James Blackwood stood just beyond the glow of the saloon's lamps, his coat collar pulled high, the scrap of parchment burning like a brand in his pocket. He unfolded it again, his thumb tracing the shaky handwriting. "They're watching. Cattle's poisoned. Check Finch's ledger." It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a cry for help. No, this was a warning. And warnings written in such desperate strokes always carried truth. James had dealt with crooks and liars his whole life. Bankers with slick tongues, ranchers with forged bills of sale, even politicians who could smile while stabbing you in the back. But something about this was different. This wasn't greed dressed up in Sunday clothes. This was rot. A sickness that, if left unchecked, could spread through his entire empire. He thought of his cattle herds, grazing under the wide Dakota sky, of the families who bought his beef, trusting it to feed their children. If Finch truly was pushing diseased meat through his saloon, it meant James's name, his reputation, was already being dragged through the mud without him even knowing it. And that waitress, Rosie. He could still see her eyes, wide and fearful, yet steady when she slipped him the note. That kind of courage didn't come cheap. She had risked everything on the chance that a ragged stranger might care enough to listen. James clenched his fist. He couldn't walk away. Pulling his coat tighter, he headed down the street toward the small telegraph office still lit at this hour. Inside, the clerk, a thin man with a crooked vest, barely looked up as James slid a folded slip across the counter. The message was short, written in a code only one man would understand. Finch Ledger, Dead Man's Saloon. Urgent. Send help. The clerk tapped the key, the sharp clicks echoing through the quiet room. James stood still, listening to each strike like the toll of a church bell. That message was bound for Arthur Pendleton, James's oldest ally. Arthur had been with him since the early days, when they drove cattle across miles of open plain, with nothing but grit and rifles. Now, Arthur served as his foreman, running much of the empire when James couldn't. He was steady, loyal, and sharp enough to smell a lie a mile away. James knew one thing. By dawn, Arthur would have men digging into Finch's past. But he also knew something else. Paper trails and investigations took time, and Finch already had reason to be suspicious. If James waited, Finch could burn the ledger before the sun came up, which meant tonight, in the dark hours between closing and sunrise, James Blackwood himself would have to dig out the truth. Stepping back into the street, James lifted his eyes to the saloon's second-story window. A faint light glowed in Finch's office. A shadow moved across the curtain. James set his jaw. The ledger was up, there, and before the night was over, so was he. Back inside Dead Man's Saloon, the noise rolled on as if nothing had happened. Dice clattering, boots stomping, laughter sharp and hollow over the piano's tinny tune. But to Rosie Vance, each sound was muffled, drowned beneath the pounding of her own heartbeat. She moved between tables with practiced grace, balancing trays heavy with whiskey glasses, her smile painted on like stage paint. To anyone watching, she was just another saloon girl, tired but polite, serving men who barely remembered her face come morning. But inside, she was shaking. The note. Lord help her. She had actually done it. She had slipped that stranger a warning, right under Finch's nose. One mistake, one wrong glance, and Finch would have her ruined. Or worse. Her eyes darted across the room. There he was, Gregory Finch, leaning against the bar in his slick waistcoat, laughing too loud with a pair of county deputies. His smile never reached his eyes. Those eyes were always moving, always hunting, and more than once they had landed on her like a hawk circling a rabbit. Rosie steadied a glass on a table, careful not to spill. To the drunk rancher grinning up at her, she gave a soft chuckle, as if his joke was funny. Inside, though, her mind was far from here. It was back home, a one-room shack on the edge of town, where her younger brother, Kevin, lay coughing through the night. 17 years old, and already looking older than most men at 30. His lungs were weak, the doctor said, a sickness he was born with. Medicine cost more than Rosie made in a month, and every coin she earned slipped through her fingers straight into the apothecary's till. And even that was never enough. She had tried everything. Double shifts, side work, pawning her mama's keepsakes, but the hole just grew deeper. Finch knew it. He had seen her exhaustion when she miscounted a shipment 2 months back. Just one mistake, and he pounced like a wolf. $500 short, he'd whispered in his office, eyes gleaming. You owe me. Until it's paid, I own you. She had tried to argue, to explain, But Finch twisted the books, turned a slip of fatigue into a debt she could never repay. And when she had balked, he had leaned close, his voice a low hiss. "Think about that sickly brother of yours. You lose this job, he loses his life." From then on, she had been his prisoner. Finch forced her to use her half-finished schooling in numbers to cook the ledgers, to cover his tracks while he lined his pockets with outlaw gold. Rosie saw things she wished she hadn't. Cattle driven in from herds known to be diseased, beef salted to mask the rot, shipments signed under names she'd never heard. Every figure she inked felt like a nail sealing her coffin. But what choice did she have? Her brother's life hung in the balance, until tonight. For the first time, Rosie had defied him. She had trusted a stranger in a ragged coat, with nothing but steady eyes and a quiet air. Maybe she was a fool. Maybe that scrap of parchment would be her death warrant. But as she wiped down a table, hands trembling, she remembered the way the man had looked at her. Not like a servant, not like a burden, but like someone who mattered. And in that memory, Rosie found a spark of strength. If Finch came for her, so be it. She had sounded the alarm. She had told the truth. And sometimes, truth was the only weapon left to a soul backed into a corner. The saloon had gone quiet for the night. Lanterns dimmed, chairs tipped on tables, the last drunks tossed into the street. Dead Man's Saloon looked like it was sleeping, but James Blackwood knew better. Behind those shuttered windows, secrets still breathed. James waited in the narrow alley beside the livery stable, the scrap of parchment still burning in his pocket. His eyes traced the saloon's second floor, where a faint glow still bled through the curtains of Finch's office. A shadow moved once, then stilled. Footsteps crunched softly in the dirt. James turned, his hand brushing the worn colt at his hip. Out of the darkness came a figure, tall, lean, moving with the quiet grace of a predator. It was a woman. She wore trail clothes, a duster that hung loose around her frame, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Her face was sharp, her eyes colder than a mountain creek at dawn. "Arthur sent me," she said, her voice low and even, carrying the faint edge of the East. "Name's Wren. Used to ride with the Pinkertons. Now I work alone." James studied her for a long moment. No wasted words, no nervous fidgeting. Just calm, steady steel. The kind of person you wanted at your back when walking into the lion's den. "You know the saloon?" James asked. Dirt gave the faintest smirk. "Better than most. Finch thinks he's clever, but clever men get sloppy. He's got a safe in that office of his. That's where your ledger will be. Staff clears out by 1. Cleaning crew shows up at 4. That gives us a 3-hour window." "You can crack it?" James asked, his voice steady. Wren shrugged like it was nothing. "I can crack anything with hinges, but the trick ain't the poise, safe. The trick is not letting Finch sniff us out before we're gone." James let out a slow breath, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't felt this alive in years. Not in boardrooms, not at cattle auctions, not counting coin in the bank, but here, in the shadows, chasing truth with his own hands. This was different. "Then tonight," he said, his jaw set, "we open that safe." Wren's eyes flickered with the faintest spark, like steel catching flint. "Good," she said. "Hope you know how to hold a mop. We ain't breaking in, we're walking in." James frowned, but Wren only tapped the brim of her hat and nodded toward the back entrance. "Midnight. Wear gray. You're a janitor now." The clock struck midnight, and Dead Man's saloon was locked tight. From the front, it looked asleep. Lanterns out, shutters drawn, only the creak of the sign swinging in the night wind. But at the back entrance, a different story unfolded. A wagon bearing the logo of Dusty Trail Cleaning Co. rattled up the alley. Out stepped two figures in e-bound gray coveralls carrying buckets and mops. To anyone glancing out a window, they looked like nothing more than the night shift crew. But one of those figures was James Blackwood, the richest man in the territory, his fine hands roughened by the disguise of labor. Beside him walked Wren, her eyes scanning every shadow like a hawk. "Keep your head down," she muttered. "Janitors don't strut. They shuffle." James gave a curt nod, pushing the mop bucket through the back door. The lock clicked open with Wren's touch. No louder than a breath. Inside, the air was heavy with stale whiskey and the faint smell of cigar smoke. The saloon was a different beast at night. Gone were the rowdy cowhands and the sharp clink of glasses. Only silence filled the wide room, broken now and then by the groan of wood settling. Moonlight cut through the shutters in thin silver lines, casting long bars across the floorboards. Wren moved first, silent as smoke. James followed, keeping the bucket close, heart pounding against his ribs. They passed the empty stage. The piano crouched in the dark like a sleeping animal, and climbed the back stairs toward Finch's office. At the top, Wren crouched low. The door was locked, a small brass safe of its own. She pulled a slim set of tools from her sleeve. "Watch the hall," she whispered. James stood guard, his back to the wall, ears straining for any sound. Every tick of the clock below sounded like thunder. His fingers itched near the colt on his hip. Then, click. The door swung open. Inside, Finch's office was just as James had imagined. Gaudy, self-important, a shrine to a man who thought too highly of himself. A gold-framed mirror. A desk carved heavier than needed. Papers stacked high, but nothing incriminating in plain sight. Wren went straight for the shelf. "Always behind the books," she muttered. Sure enough, a row of unread ledgers hid a steel safe set into the wall. She cracked her knuckles, leaned in, and began to work. James's pulse thudded in his ears. Down the hall, the floor groaned. Was someone there? He held his breath, one hand resting on the mop handle, the other near his revolver. But no one came. Then, a soft clunk. The safe yawned open. Wren pulled it wide. Inside sat bundles of cash, a revolver, and a black leather-bound ledger. She lifted it gently, her eyes narrowing at the weight. "This is what you came for," she whispered. James stepped forward, running his hand across the cracked leather. The very thing Rosie had risked everything to tell him about. The truth, locked away in a book. "Photographic memory?" Wren asked. "Better," James said. "I don't forget what I read." She flipped the pages, her small lantern lighting numbers, shipments, and names. James's jaw tightened. The evidence was clear. Diseased cattle, bought for pennies, sold to the town as prime beef. His brand was stamped over every page, used as a mask for Finch's rot. But worse still, tucked between the ledgers, were notes in Finch's sharp scrawl, threats against Rosie Vance. Her name, her brother's illness, her so-called debt. Proof of the chains he used to keep her silent. James's hand curled into a fist. He wanted to storm down the hall, drag Finch from his bed, and end it right then. But Wren's hand on his arm stopped him. "Not yet," she whispered. "We take the evidence. We walk out clean. At dawn, you bury him proper." James nodded, forcing the fury down. He slipped the ledger inside his coat, replaced the safe's contents just as they were, and shut the door. Not a trace left behind. Together, they slipped back into the night, disappearing as silently as they had come. And as James climbed into the waiting wagon, one thought burned hotter than all the rest. Rosie hadn't lied. She had told him the truth, and for that truth, she had risked her life. By the time the first light crept over Deadwood Hollow, James Blackwood was back in a rented room above the livery. The ledger sat open across the table, its pages spread wide like the guts of a dying beast. Arthur Pendleton had answered his coded telegraph before dawn. The old foreman arrived with a pair of trusted men, riders who'd been with James since his earliest cattle drives. They weren't bookkeepers, but they knew numbers well enough to see when something stank. And this stank worse than a dead steer in July. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, flipping through the cramped handwriting. "Look here," he said, tapping the page. "Shipments from ranches that don't exist. Sales marked as prime beef when the herds were condemned months back." Another rider leaned over. "Names here match outlaws I heard about running meat through Montana. Finch has been buying cheap from diseased stock, then selling it under your brand." James's jaw tightened. Every mark on those pages was another dagger aimed at the Blackwood name. If word got out that his beef was rotten, the empire he'd built would fall faster than a card house in a dust storm. Arthur turned another page, and his face grew darker. "Here, notes about Rosie Vance. Says she's indebted to him. Mentions her brother's illness. He's been using it to keep her quiet, forcing her to do his numbers." James's fist slammed against the table, rattling the lantern. "She's no partner. She's his prisoner." The room went quiet. The only sound the faint crow of a rooster outside. Arthur removed his spectacles, folding them slow. "Then, the girl's braver than most men I've known. She handed you this truth, knowing it could cost her life." James closed the ledger, the leather cover rough beneath his palm. He felt the weight of it, heavier than gold, heavier than all the land he owned. This wasn't just numbers on paper. It was proof of poison. Poison running through his empire, his town, and even the lives of innocents. He looked out the window. The sun was climbing, painting the sky in fire and gold. Somewhere down that street, Rosie was likely tying her apron strings, walking back into Finch's den as if nothing had happened. James's voice was low, steady, but filled with steel. "By sundown, Finch will be in irons, and Rosie Vance will never answer to him again." Arthur nodded. "Then we best prepare. The law will need this ledger, but the people will need to see the truth with their own eyes." James slipped the ledger inside his coat and buckled his gun belt tight. He wasn't just a cattle baron now. He was a man on a mission, and the day ahead would decide more than his empire. It would decide justice. By midday, Deadwood Hollow buzzed like a hornet's nest. Word spread fast. Blackwood himself was in town. Folks lined the dusty street, whispering, craning their necks for a glimpse of the cattle baron most had only heard about. 2 black coaches rolled to a stop in front of Dead Man's saloon. Out stepped James Blackwood, no longer in rags but in a sharp charcoal suit that caught the sunlight. At his side walked Arthur Pendleton and 2 federal marshals, their badges glinting like cold steel. Inside, the saloon froze. Cards stopped. Mid-deal, whiskey glasses hung in mid-air. All eyes turned as James pushed through the swinging doors. Behind the bar, Finch straightened, his smirk faltering. He had expected some cattle buyer, or perhaps a crooked sheriff, come to share a drink. But the sight of James, the real James, not the ragged drifter from the night before, knocked the air from his lungs. "You," Finch stammered, his voice cracking. James didn't answer him. Instead, he walked straight to the small table, by the kitchen doors, the worst seat in the house. He placed his hand on it, steady, deliberate. "I sat here last night," James said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "And from this table, I learned more about this saloon and the men who run it than I ever did from ledgers in my office." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. James's gaze swept the room until it landed on Rosie. She stood, frozen with a tray of mugs in her hands, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. Finch barked a laugh, trying to recover his swagger. "This is nonsense. You think you can walk in here and—" "Enough!" James's voice cut like a whip. He stepped closer, his coat shifting just enough to reveal the black ledger tucked inside. "I've seen your books, Finch. The shipments. From outlaw herds, diseased cattle passed as prime. Money funneled to men whose names belong on wanted posters. You've been poisoning this town under my brand." Gasps filled the room. A rancher at the corner table slammed his fist. "My boy's been sick since last week." "You mean—" Finch's face drained of color. "Lies," he spat, his voice cracking. "All lies cooked up by her." He pointed a trembling finger at Rosie. "She helped me. She cooked the books. The marshals moved, but James raised a hand to stop them. He turned to Rosie, his voice softening. "Rosie Vance, would you step forward?" Her tray shook as she set it down. She walked slowly, every eye on her, her knees threatening to buckle. James's gaze stayed locked on her, calm and steady, like a rope to hold on to. "Did you help this man?" James asked, his tone gentle but firm. Rosie's lip trembled. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Then she lifted her chin, her voice breaking but clear. "He threatened me, said he'd ruin me, said my brother would lose his medicine. I didn't want to, but—" She looked at Finch, fury flashing through her tears. "I'd rather die than keep his secrets." The room erupted. Shouts, curses, boots stomping on the floorboards. James raised his hand again, and silence fell. He nodded to the marshals. "You have what you need." The lawmen seized Finch as he thrashed and spat, dragging him toward the door. His cries of, "She's lying! She's lying!" were drowned beneath the roar of the crowd, hungry for justice. James turned back to Rosie. Her shoulders sagged, the weight of months of fear breaking at last. "Last night," James said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear, "a young woman risked her life to do what was right. She didn't think of profit. She didn't think of safety. She thought of truth." He paused, letting the words hang. Rosie's eyes filled with tears. "That young woman is the reason we stand here now. She is no servant of corruption. She is a hero." The room erupted, again, this time in cheers. Rosie covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed. James stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Your debt is gone. Your brother will have the care he needs. For life. And as for you, I want you to work for me. Not as a waitress, but as my eyes and conscience. Director of Ethical Oversight. Do you accept?" Rosie's breath hitched. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she nodded, whispering, "Yes, yes, I accept." The saloon thundered with applause, boots pounding the floor, hats raised high. Finch was dragged. Out into the light, his reign ended. And at the heart of it all stood Rosie Vance. Once a tired waitress with worn shoes, now a symbol of courage. By sundown, Deadwood Hollow was a different town. Gregory Finch was shackled in the back of a marshal's wagon, bound for a long trial and a short rope. The townsfolk filled the streets, buzzing with the story. How the mighty cattle baron had walked into his own saloon dressed as a drifter, and how a young waitress had brought down a crook with nothing but courage and a folded scrap of paper. From the balcony of the saloon, James Blackwood watched the wagon roll away. He stood tall in his tailored coat, but for the first time in years, he felt stripped of the armor of wealth. He was just a man again. A man who had come searching for honesty, and found it in the unlikeliest of places. Beside him stood Rosie Vance. Her hands still trembled, but there was light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The weight of fear was gone, replaced by something new. Purpose. James spoke low enough for only her to hear. I thought I came here to test the world, to see if honesty still lived among men. But it was you, Rosie. You reminded me that wealth ain't in cattle or coin. It's in courage, in doing right when the world would rather you stay silent. Rosie swallowed hard, her voice soft but steady. I didn't feel brave, Mr. Blackwood. I just couldn't stand by any more. He smiled faintly. That's the very heart of bravery. Down below, Arthur Pendleton barked orders, already setting the foundation for a new division of Blackwood's empire. One dedicated to protecting workers, keeping the supply clean, and making sure no Finch ever rose in the shadows again. And at the center of it, James had promised, would be Rosie. Her brother would be cared for, her debt erased, her voice heard. As the last of the crowd began to thin, James looked out across the town, the horizon burning gold with the setting sun. He had thought he was hunting for honesty. What he found was far greater. Sometimes heroes weren't men in fine suits or with iron in their holsters. Sometimes they were young women with worn shoes, tired eyes, and a courage that refused to die. And, as the night settled over Deadwood Hollow, James knew one thing with certainty. True wealth isn't what you own. It's the good you leave behind.